What did AxCon add to the EAA discussion? Because there were like several presentations about the EAA. But just to remind you, the European Accessibility Act, the basis of it is a minimum harmonization statute, so that they want all the member countries to adopt the EAA as their national law, and it's a minimum. So that means that every country can do their own thing as long as they at least meet the minimum law and they can add to it. So it doesn't really make it uniform across every EU country. So if you do business with the EU and you do business between different member countries, you still have to understand what are the laws for each of those countries. But they want to at least bring everybody up to a certain standard. And so that's why they call it a minimum harmonization statute. And just the timeline of it, they started talking about it back in 2019 is when it became law. And they gave time for each of the 27 member states to pass their own laws by 2022 to implement it. A lot of countries missed the deadline, and now more of them are meeting it. And then finally, June 28th, 2025, widespread enforcement of the EAA is expected, and you will get penalties if you're not compliant. So a global company that does business in Europe will need to comply with the EAA. And by 2030, the European Commission, it's actually the other way out, each country has to report to the Commission their compliance. And then after that, it's a 5-year reporting period. And it's not just software, it's also hardware. So it's more of a wide reach. It's not just digital accessibility. It's also making sure all your computers, operating systems, smartphone, communication devices, ATMs, payment terminals, any sort of interactive terminals, so kiosks, e-readers, ticketing, check-in machines, everything has to be
Um,
accessible. So it's more than just digital accessibility, and specifically services related to communication, commerce, finance, and transportation, and affects telecommunication services, banking, e-commerce, transport. So transport's big, like all the websites that have to do with air, bus, rail, and water. So all their kiosks, all their mobile services, everything. E-books as well, and then any sort of audiovisual media services, and then also affects their European emergency number, which is 112. There are exceptions. Anything that was created like archive, so pre-recorded time-based media. So videos that you've recorded that were before won't necessarily be effective, but moving forward, yes, because it would be hard to redo all the media that you might have created before 2025. And the same thing with like documents and office files. So anything that was prior to the deadline is exempted. Navigation maps, and then third-party content. So if you run a website, but people are allowed to make comments or do things, you can't really enforce it onto your consumer users to make sure that the comments they make are made in an accessible manner. So that's what they mean by third-party content. But if you license third-party content, then you've deliberately made a relationship with the third party, then that should be made accessible. But if it's third-party content, they use the example they was usually user commenting and things like that. And then archival content. So things that are just, this is our archive of material that's maybe from years ago. You don't have to go back and fix that. It's just, but it should be noted that it's an archive and that it's not being currently updated. So the moment you update it, that content, then that becomes affected by the law. But if it's really something that you've done and you're not going to touch anymore, but it's just available for people to look at your history, then that doesn't need to be made accessible. So countries have to bring in enforcement in June, and that's why it's important to take action now. And what are the possible penalties? So again, it depends on which country. You can be fined in some countries, you can be banned from doing business in those countries. It depends. And then you'll also lose business opportunities with customers from the disabled community if you don't comply. And if you're someone that's trying to do B2B, business to business procurement of contracts, then you'll lose business and you'll have reputational damage. And what are the compliance standards that are expected? So the EAA uses the EN 301549 standard, which is its own standard. However, the digital accessibility portion of that is the WCAG 2.1 AA standard. So as long as you're looking at WCAG 2.1 AA for your website, you're probably fine. Although there is going to be an update eventually to 2.2. And because the EN 301549 is bigger than WCAG, they have other requirements for software, hardware, and other things. Europe itself is about 101 million people. 1 in 4 have a disability, so about 25% of the population, and about 215 of the EU is over than 65 years of age. 1.3 billion people worldwide have a disability, and 1 in 6 have a disability. EU aging population, there, just like the United States, the statistic is a little bit higher on how many people have disabilities as opposed to global. Hopefully you started already, but if you haven't started, you need to start now. This is only
Yeah.
April. And keep in mind any sort of multi-year contractual agreements that you've made that, you know, that have to be redone. And the AxCon, they actually, one of the presentations went into the whole history of disability rights in Europe. And that was interesting. But basically, the disability rights movement gained momentum in Europe after World War II. And then the human rights movement in the 20th century. 1997 was the Amsterdam Treaty, which marked a turning point where persons were with disabilities were recognized within the EU framework. The European Disability Forum, the EDF, was founded in 1996 with EU project funding. It's an NGO or non-governmental nonprofit organization that represents the European disability movement. It's an umbrella nonprofit that has members of other nonprofits that focus on disability rights. So 110 organizations are members. Examples include the European Union of the Deaf, Autism Europe, Inclusion Europe, which primarily focuses on intellectual disabilities and and other national disability organizations. It's led by people with disabilities and their families. They defend, promote, and advocate for the rights of the 100 million persons with disabilities in Europe. They are hoping to have full implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And they try to engage in EU policy making, and they try to leverage EU policies at the national level. So they were instrumental in getting a transport accessibility, like the European parking card, that they're entitled to get access to parking rights and facilities in multiple countries. So if you get the European parking card, then you have access to disabled parking in all of the EU countries.
Kind of like the handicap placard here in the States.
Similar, I think.
Okay, yeah.
They also advocated for the EU ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2011. They proposed a web accessibility directive in 2012 that was adopted in 2016. They've focused on public sector websites and mobile apps. And the EAA was proposed in 2015, and it was more about goods and services and trade as opposed to necessarily civil rights. I think they were unable to really get traction on making it the argument that it's a civil right for people with disabilities. They were more saying that by doing this, it will improve trade within the EU and there will be better movement of goods and services, people and capital. So they had to make the money argument to get it to be passed, really. They also they're trying to get an anti-discrimination legislation. They've already got 1 million signatures, but right now it got blocked. So that's one of their challenges is trying to get this legislation passed to avoid discrimination against people with disabilities. And so they are continuing to advocate for more capacity building and health policy coordination. The deputy director, Alejandro Molero, was one of the speakers at AxCon, so he was talking about what he's been doing. and the focus on digital and general accessibility. So the EDF plays a pivotal role in shaping disability rights in Europe. They've made progress, but they still have a lot of challenges, and ongoing advocacy is needed so that they can push forward these anti-discrimination laws. In Europe, the legislative process is that the European Commission will propose laws and initiatives, try to implement this UN convention, and then they develop a strategy. The Parliament and the Council of the EU are co-legislatures, and then they make amendments and agreements to make it a law. There's, I think the issue with your EU, like after going through these, it's very bureaucratic. There's so much you have to go through.
Sounds like it.
They're trying to get national law compliance. There's some mandate 587 where they're trying to revise standards, create a design for all built environment, and then also trying to develop standards for non-digital information, support services, and emergency communications. And so some of the missed opportunities when they were doing the EAA is that they didn't include the built environment. So they didn't focus on like making your office or things like that covered. They didn't really get coverage for making sure household appliances and urban transport were included and trying to get procurement. So trying to get the government to have a standard and how it procures technology is still like a complex issue. It wasn't standardized. So there were some failings with when they brought in the EAA just because it was just all the people involved in the bureaucracy of it all. And their concern is to try to make it beneficial to everyone also, not just people with disabilities. So the design for all approach. And Brexit, of course, happens. The UK did take part of the Web Accessibility Directive as part of their laws, but they don't really have a national law in place that it achieves the whole scope of the EAA in the UK. So with the EU, there are a ton of different standards that are important to know. So they have 7.5 standards that do incorporate the WCAG, but involve other things that Europe is concerned about. So these are all the standards that exist in Europe. So you have the EN 301549, which is the core standard that the EAA is asking you to comply with. They also incorporate the WCAG. They have this other EN 17161, which is a design for all initiative. And they wanted that to be updated and then eventually be part of the EAA. They're developing a standard for support services, they're developing a standard for non-digital information, and they're developing a standard for emergency services. And then they're developing a standard EN 17210 for the built environment that wasn't included. And then they're creating they call it a half standard, that's why it's 0.5, that ebooks have to meet the standard as well. So basically, with how this works with their standards, is that you need to be able to provide alternatives for speech, video, and other functionality, and there should be multiple ways for people to achieve compliance. The EN 301509 has been around since 2014, and it was updated to include WCAG 2.1 in 2021, and then there's going to be an update again eventually. And 301.509 also has different sections that have to do with a particular technology. So there's a section about phones, there's a section about media players, there's a section about hardware. And so section 9 is what would be concerned with digital accessibility, but they also have standards regarding desktop files and software. And when we talk about the WCAG, we always talk about the POUR principles, so the perceivable, operable, understandable, robust, and our different conformance levels, where double A is the considered where we are with our standards. And again, WCAG has evolved. So since 2008, it was the establishment of the POUR principles and the 3 levels of conformance, but now we already have 2.2 out there in 2023, but it's not adopted yet by any of the laws. So Usually what they do is they release a standard out there, they see how it goes, and then when it gets adopted more widely, then it's considered for becoming the new standard. And then EN 30549 also, with regards to biometrics, they don't want it to be reliable on only a single biological characteristic. And then they have a separate clause to address mobile applications. WCAG 3.0 is also under development, and who knows when that will be released. When we talk about support services, they mean hotlines, help desk, and customer support. And the design for all, again, is something that they're working on. The built environment would include ticketing machines, terminals, and things like that. And when we talk about non-digital information, they want to create a standard for packaging and labels and printed instructions. So they even want to make sure that how you package things is going to be the same and provides the same information. So that once they implement, that'll be another issue that people will have to comply with if they want to work with the European market. And then with the emergency services, they want to make sure that sign language and that everything works cross-border. So with the ebooks, they want to make sure that ebooks will work with all types of assistive technologies. The W3C has actually released a standard in 2024 for EPUB accessibility 1.1. And then Europe would want to make sure that any sort of digital rights cannot block the accessibility features. So the EU standards are really wide ranging. It's more comprehensive than other countries. And they want to make it eventually a design for all, inclusion of all type of standard. And we have to keep in mind other upcoming standards that may be coming out there, like the WCAG 3.0 and other regulations, and when they're going to be incorporated into the laws. And they're also trying to create laws for mobile applications as well.
That's a lot, yeah. And I can just see that while there's still bureaucracy in the EU for all this, they're getting a lot done. Seems like a lot more done than we're getting done over here.
Yeah, I think Europe is with the EAA, they're going to be the leader. They're going to ones, just like GPDR, they're going to be the ones that are setting the standard. Because kind
Yeah,
of, I think with what's happening here, we've abdicated any sort of leadership role with what we're doing now, which is too bad. But
yeah, I think so it is. But yeah, especially with the changes recently. Yeah,
I think, yeah, there's still the litigation that's happening here. That's really what's going to force people to do anything in the United States is just ongoing litigation.
yeah,
And what are the results of these cases that happen? The controversy over Title III are if you don't have a physical web store or physical store, do you have to, are you considered a place of public accommodation? Do you have to follow the ADA? All that stuff that's unclear will be decided in the courts.
yeah. And like with the GDPR, until those teeth and the fines really start affecting American companies, they probably won't be as prevalent.
Yeah, I think EU's been fining a lot of big companies like Google and Meta both got big fines.
Yeah, I
I
remember.
don't even remember what it was that they were non-compliant with exactly with European law, like what they were doing wrong. Yeah, a lot of these companies they get pushed more by because they want to be global companies. That's why they are forced to follow all these things. So
And that changes the scale as far as if a website is really global, if your customer focus isn't Europe, if you don't really have that customer base, it's not as relevant to a smaller business necessarily.
it would be hard for Europe to necessarily enforce some of the things. For example, the cookie banner, where that's mainly a European requirement because unless you're a giant company.
Yeah.
So the idea that someone complained that you don't have a cookie banner and it's probably not going to hit a small company as bad as a big
Yeah.
company. Yeah.
I think that was the confusion with GDPR is like how far reaching it was and how seriously a different sized company was supposed to take that. I think that confusion bleeds into accessibility stuff as far as those standards too. I think accessibility though is more universal than a cookie banner, obviously. I think that's what you were saying, just that accept the inclusion for all type of language you were talking about in there. I think that's really the gist of all of this, that it doesn't matter if you have a disability or not, that if there's some barrier for you to using something, then it needs to be improved. And I think that's what gets lost sight in some of this too. Interesting.